Welcome everybody to GES seminar series for today, Wednesday, October 21st. In a minute, I will turn it over to Jason Chase, who is the host for today, who will introduce our speaker. I just want to let people know that our next seminar is a couple of weeks down the road, Wednesday, November 11th, because next Wednesday and Thursday is the Baltimore Ecosystem Study annual meeting, so there's no seminar that day. And I made an executive decision that the day after the election was a day when either people will be in mourning or celebrating, depending upon their political perspective and what happens. So I thought the day after the election was not a great day to try to be focusing on the seminar. Wednesday, November 11th, we'll have Dr. Ming Lee, who's a professor at the Horn Point Laboratory at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. And he's going to be talking about the impacts of climate change and coastline management on coastal inundation in Baltimore and Chesapeake Bay. It's a really interesting talk. I heard him give it at a meeting we had earlier in the summer. So I encourage people to attend that and to invite people to attend it as well. So at this point, I'm going to invite Jason Chase to introduce our speaker today, and then we're going to turn it over to our speaker, Josh. Yeah.
All right. Hey, everyone. It's great to have you all here. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Joshua Caplan. Dr. Joshua Caplan is a research associate from the Department of Architecture and Environmental Design at Temple University in Philadelphia, where his research addresses how plants and soils respond to intensive modification of the abiotic environment. His PhD is from Portland State University, where he worked with Alan Eakley, investigating how a pernicious invasive plant deals with seasonal water shortages. Josh has since held positions at Rutgers University, the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, and Bryn Mawr College, working with plants and soils experiencing an array of conditions, such as elevated CO2, altered precipitation regimes, heavy metal exposure, and nutrient pollution. Much of his recent work has been in Philadelphia's green stormwater infrastructure systems, which we'll focus on in this seminar today. He's also part of a team planning a study at UMBC beginning next year to determine how the water use of urban trees is influenced by species and site characteristics. And so with this seminar today, water everywhere, but not so much to drink, limitations on plant water use in green stormwater infrastructure systems. I'd like to give it up for Josh Caplan.
All right, thank you very much, Jason. So if I can do this right, I will share my screen. Oh, it looks like you're seeing the wrong one. Sorry about that. There we go. All right, technology is working. Yeah, this is exciting. I'm glad to be able to speak with all of you. I've met a small handful. Good to be here with some colleagues I've have had some affiliation with, and so many new people as well. So yeah, interestingly, I work in this architecture and environmental design program. So I'm surrounded by people who are thinking about design, but I myself am more of a plant eco-hydrologist and physiologist, and so it's been interesting to kind of take what I learned and have done a lot of work with from the more ecological side of things and apply that into the design realm. So I'm part of a group that includes both Villanova University and Temple University, a couple teams from each institute, and we're mainly focusing on green stormwater infrastructure in Philadelphia. There's a couple of different major projects that these teams have tackled. I'll describe a piece of each of those projects here today. The theme, of course, is basically how plants and how they use water may not be as intended by the designers. So let's take a look. How do I flip? Oop, how do I get to the next one? Here we go. So before kind of getting into the details, I thought it would be very important to make sure that we all understand why green stormwater infrastructure are being used so widely across the continent and really world these days. Many cities are investing heavily in them. They're building stormwater, green stormwater infrastructure by the hundreds each year. Interestingly, though, it's not all cities. It's specifically those that use combined sewer systems. So LA is not one of these, but Philadelphia, Baltimore, Portland, many of the East Coast cities and others are. So what is it about these combined sewer systems that makes GSI important? So we're kind of getting into the city scale utility here, but they're designed to take both the sewer water and the stormwater, combine them into a single pipe, and send that kind of combined water mix to the water treatment plant. Now, that works great when it's dry or when there are only small storms occurring, but after a certain threshold, they're actually kind of designed to fail, you could say, in that once a certain threshold is exceeded, that combined sewer water will overflow into the waterway directly. This is something that may have been fine 100 years ago when cities were much less populated. There was much less impervious cover, and so these events would happen infrequently. However, these overflow events have occurred more and more commonly, especially as impervious cover has increased because storms are flashier, more water rushes into the system all at once, and those thresholds are exceeded more frequently. So as a result, back maybe around 1990, the EPA started getting involved pretty heavily and saying to cities, look, we have to control these releases of sewage into our waterways. We need to reduce the frequency and intensity of CSO events. And so cities have tackled this in a number of different ways. Gray infrastructure has been used prominently. I think Boston has invested especially in this type, but many cities have used a mix. So, yeah, larger pipes, bigger treatment plants do work. However, they're very expensive, millions of dollars per project, and they don't really get to the heart of the problem. Whereas green infrastructure, it solves or avoids some of those issues in that essentially when you're putting in green infrastructure, you're putting in an array of distributed small water capture devices, right? So instead of going directly into the sewer system and the combined sewer system, the water is trapped and is essentially mitigating for the fact that there's all this impervious cover across the city. And so it does work to prevent these events, and they're also cheaper, at least per project. So they also have a lot of co-benefits. They're great in terms of aiding in green streets and green acreage initiatives. Philadelphia has pushed this very explicitly. They can capture metals, nutrients, and organic pollutants. So by and large, they're very successful type of infrastructure that are widespread for a good reason. So thinking about the variety of GSIs out there, McPhillips, who I believe is at least spent some time in Baltimore, now at Penn State, and Matzler, they put together this interesting kind of concept model of how you can think of GSIs in the context of infrastructure generally. They generally combine some kind of techno or what I've called gray infrastructure with the green, right, with the plants and soils. I will mention that the tree trenches, which are not on this diagram, but are probably more on the techno side in that they largely contain a gravel bed, sand layer beneath. There's geotextiles. They have this embedded tree trench and distribution pipes. Sorry, I meant to say soil pits with fairly substantial sized trees. They're really good in a kind of a residential or an area where you're trying to increase street trees. But despite the sort of the possibility that these trenches and these GSIs are designed for plants, there are some drawbacks. But let me start by thinking about the hydrologic effects of plants in GSIs to begin with. Like, what purpose do they serve? They do aid in interception, infiltration, and evapotranspiration. I think the way to consider evapotranspiration here as it doesn't necessarily have a great effect on the storm immediately as it's happening, but it helps kind of remove water from the soil between storm events, right? So it kind of resets the system between storms. They also play very important roles in terms of providing aesthetics. That's something I think we all appreciate. Prevent soil erosion, cast shade, provide pollinator habitat, and increase air quality, filtering particulates and such. So they do have a lot of positive benefits. We want to keep them healthy. However, when we think about the way that trenches and other GSIs are designed, their primary mission is really to hold and infiltrate water. Supplying water to plants is secondary at best. And in fact, this is kind of baked into the design regulations. Engineers have to follow design manuals. And so, they have a specific design storms that have, specific amount of water delivered over a certain period. That is in fact what determines the capacity and therefore the sizing of each of these GSIs. And they have to drain at a specific rate. For instance, in Philadelphia, they're required to maintain zero standing water after 72 hours. There's a lot of kind of specific directions that the designers are required to abide by when building these and designing these. So that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. And in fact, the thesis of this talk is that there are aspects of the design that are antithetical to plants, and it largely has to do with the hydrology, but also water quality. So I'm going to first describe this first one, overdesign, which you could also consider like being oversized. This gets back to the regulations. By and large, and this is starting to change, the designers are required in many cases to use what's called static sizing. So essentially they treat the GSI as like a bathtub that's plugged. And during the storm, the appropriate depth fills over specified time, and that's how you determine the dimensions. Only then would the bathtub be unplugged and allowed to infiltrate. So engineers know this is not realistic, but takes a while for policies to change. As a result, though, many of these GSIs do not account for the fact that, in fact, they are infiltrating, or more appropriate term might be exfiltrating, right? They sort of trap the water in the gravel beds or the soil, and then slowly releasing it to the soil below. So there's this exfiltration process that it's just not accounted for in the design manuals. So doing that would be what's called dynamic sizing. It's starting to come into effect, but in many cases we have trenches that are even larger than they are intended to be. In addition, there's media that's typically very coarse, drains rapidly. There's a host of water quality issues, especially salinity, that I'll address in some detail. And in fact, despite the fact that plants are put in all areas of GSIs, in a lot of cases, think of the rain gardens that have some topography, those higher elevation areas don't receive the water directly. In fact, they may never actually come in contact with stormwater. What that means, though, is that they can be experiencing prolonged periods of hydrologic drought between storms. So turning our attention to overdesign in the context of tree trenches, what I want to do is kind of give a bit of overview and then dive into our main system. Tree trenches are very, very widespread in Philadelphia. A colleague at Philadelphia Water Department gave me these numbers today. There are now 1,634 trees in Philadelphia streets in the context of trenches, and that accounts for 660 separate trenches. They are building them by the hundreds every year, so there will be many more coming up. So the way these work, by the way, is that they're essentially intended to receive the stormwater just off of roadways and whatnot. The water is then captured and distributed laterally, aided by this distribution pipe. It fills the gravel beds, and that water rises high enough then to deliver water to the soil pits and to, therefore, the trees themselves. That's the intention, but the question here is, given overdesign and these coarse textured soils, does the functionality actually hold up? What's the effect of not accounting for exfiltration? And by extension, what are the implications for plant water stress? So that's kind of the piece of the project that the Temple team took on. And again, this was a collaborative project with Villanova University, part of that an EPA STAR grant that began around 2015. So this site is basically the focus of the Villanova Temple effort. There's something like 11 different tree trenches in this neighborhood that is, I guess, specifically around a school and its athletic facility. But they drain the streets. It's something like a 12-to-1 loading ratio. So every square meter of trench will drain 12 square meter of street. There are typically about 2 to 5 of these in a gravel bed. The gravel has about 45% porosity rate. That's where the water is going. And in this set, there were 13 species, but 2 in this focal system shown in orange, right? That's the one that I've got a picture of here, and I'm showing a side view of here. So in this pit, in this trench, there were 5 tree pits with 3 London plane trees, the Platanus, and 2 Freeman's maples, the Acer. And so there was an intensive effort on this trench from Villanova, monitoring it with all of their hydrological devices, as well as by Temple doing some kind of plant physiology work. So the first thing that our combined team tried to do with respect to understanding overdesign was say, okay, over the course of the 3 years that we have this monitoring record, how frequently have the storms actually reached the soil pits? So the Villanova's data set gave us the depths of water during each storm, and the maximum water level was what we extracted and then kind of plotted here as a frequency histogram. And as you can see, when you consider that each of these boxes are showing how deep the bottom of those 5 soil pits were, the maximum water depth of the biggest storm that occurred in that 3-year period didn't quite reach even the lowest of the pits. This is the effect of overdesign. These trenches were intended to fill to a certain level, but because they didn't account for exfiltration, they simply missed the target. However, they're working great with respect to infiltration, but not so good for the plants. What we decided to do next was kind of say, okay, what happens if we simulate a very large storm, which we did by doing what's called a runoff test. We essentially opened up a fire hydrant with the help of PWD. And this event occurred, I think, August 1st of 2018. Over the course of 3 hours, a lot of water was dumped onto the street. That's what's being shown in this picture. There's a fluorescein dye added as a tracer, but it looks kind of funny, but it's evidently perfectly harmless. That's what they tell me. But point being, with this storm, we were able to raise the water high enough to actually contact the soil pits. Up to about 1 meter is the highest water level that it reached. And the soil moisture sensors were also recording data that whole time. Interestingly, none of them actually showed a response. So I'm only showing data from one of those sensors here. This is the deepest one. It was at 60 centimeters depth within one of the soil pits. And even at that depth, towards the bottom of those pits, there was absolutely no response to the storm. It wasn't broken. Overnight there was a storm, and in fact, it showed an increase there. But this is not indicative of kind of the intended effect, the intended functionality. The piece that I led was measuring stomatal conductance. This is a measure of the tree's response, specifically kind of how much water they're willing to release. There's 2 components to how much water is actually released. One is sort of how open the plants make their pores, right, the stomatal conductance, but then there's the evaporative demand from the atmosphere, and this normalizes to the evaporative demand. So that's really not a factor here. As that changes through the day, that's taken out of consideration. This is just showing kind of how willing the trees are to release water, how open their pores are. So we went to those 5 trees over and over again through the course of the day. We also added a London plane that was kind of around the corner in a next tree trench that did not experience this storm. And there were some pretty clear differences between the two species. But interestingly, again, with the exception of period 3, almost zero response to the storm. In fact, what we think was going on in period 3 was simply the midday rest effect. Trees will often kind of slow down to conserve water in the middle of the day. Note that the tree, this triangle that was not in the trench receiving stormwater, also slowed down. So there's good evidence of that. Basically, the trees didn't even notice our enormous storm. Effectively, I think what all this tells us is that the gray component of this GSI and the green component are just not functioning together. They're essentially separate systems. Another way to put that is that the trench is too deep given exfiltration. And in fact, not only is exfiltration occurring during the storm, emptying the gravel bed into the soil below, but it's also probably occurring through the sidewalls. Again, this is something that the design is not intended to account for. So turning our attention to that lack of soil moisture response, that sort of puzzling flat line that we saw, our suspicion is that it might have to do with the media. In other words, GSI typically has very coarse soils used because, again, the main intention is to drain the stormwater into the surrounding environment, not to deliver it to trees. So we tried to get a little more insight into this by looking at the soil water retention, the actual kind of hydraulic property of the soil, and then feeding that into a model. So this plot here, it actually took me about 3 weeks to generate these numbers, but what it shows is how well the water retains, how well the soil retains water across a spectrum of tension. So I think I'll leave it to those of you with great soil physics experience to think about the nuances here. But the point is that it drops off very steeply here as you get into the higher tensions. What this essentially tells us is that there's a lot of coarse, there's a lot of large pores, right, which you expect with the coarse texture of the soil. What we then did was feed this into a hydrous model. This is what my colleague Peter from Villanova did. And essentially, he took this cross section of the soil pit and simulated our hydrant release, pausing it at the moment when the water was at its maximum depth. That's basically what's shown here, right? It rose to about 13 centimeters, I think. And so even at that moment, when the water was definitely intercepting the pit, there was so little water retention of the soil pores that even just 10 centimeters above, you wouldn't have expected a response by the sensor, right? So in other words, it all fits. It's at least corroborating evidence that the system works as we think it does, and that there's very little capillary action by the soil to retain that water and to pull that water upwards, even during a very large storm. So the soil media is making it even more difficult for the trees to get water even when it is available. What we do now is turn our attention to the tree response and think about how the variation in biology affects responses to these often drier conditions than expected. So this is a set of plots that's showing small conductance measured across a season. And this is each of the 13 species in our, I think, 11 tree trenches at the site. So each dot represents, I think, the mean of a couple measurements per tree, but on various days. A group of students went out every couple days a week for a growing season and gathered this data set. What we see is some pretty big variation. There's variation in the mean of somatic conductance. If you go from species to species, I should call it taxa because there's some cultivars here. But a big part of that variation, I think, actually has to do with the slope as somatic conductance responds to evaporative demand. That's what's on the x-axis here. That's the vapor pressure deficit. So as the air gets drier, how do the plants respond? Do they close up and have a negative slope, restricting their water use? Do they maintain a relatively stable water use, despite the changes in vapor pressure deficit? And both of those things happen. There are actually a couple of cases where something else happens. In fact, the plants are increasing their small conductance despite the increased evaporative demand of the atmosphere. That's kind of weird. I'd never seen that before. I did see it documented in a paper that explained it as an effort to cool leaves. So that's quite possibly what's going on here. But this implies that the trees do have sufficient water supply. In the context of this set of trenches, that's actually quite surprising, given everything I talked about before. So this requires a bit of further thought, which I'll come back to in a minute. But I want to point out that we did look a little bit more closely at the water relations of the trees in that focal trench, the Acer and the Platanus. And these bottom plots are mimicking, they're showing the same data as these two over here. But the top plots are showing the tension on the leaf xylem, right? So this is called leaf water potential, is essentially how hard the water is being pulled inside the xylem, the water conduits in the plant. And in the case of the Acer, which has a fairly typical decline in stoneout conductance as VPD increases, there's a fairly typical decline in leaf water potential, including a kind of dropping below this negative 1.5 threshold. Negative 1.5 is important because it's the level at which plants will often wilt. Now, if plants experience this amount of tension for prolonged periods, it can cause embolisms and cavitation in the xylem. And if even more prolonged periods, it can cause tissue death. And so, this is important, that the placement of this decline is in many cases exceeding that negative 1.5 for the Acer. Even though the Platanus are also declining, they're generally staying above that line. They're really not experiencing water stress in a problematic way. So, coming back to this question of why some of the species are just not even really noticing, or at least they're avoiding water stress because of, or despite the high VPD, there's a couple things that we think might be contributing to that. And it really comes down to the biology. Certain species have a propensity to seek out water. And in the case of, these tree trenches, they can find it just a meter or so below in the bottom of the trench and the native soil underlying the trench. So they have to get through that gravel bed. But, if they seek it out, they in fact will find it. And I guess this brings us to the point that over the course of a tree's lifetime in a pit like this, overdesign may be specifically an issue for young trees until they can kind of make that leap into the surrounding soils. I will point out that the engineers that design tree trenches really don't anticipate or typically want trees to explore these deeper soils. They will clog distribution pipes, and in fact, we do see in a maintenance video that there are roots growing into the distribution pipe. This does confirm that they're getting down outside of the soil pits. We think they're going even further. But point being, this is sort of an issue for the young trees. If they get big enough, they can probably be much more buffered across species. But there's another biological factor here that has more to do with the toleration of cavitation risk. What I'm showing in this plot over here is the same data that you saw in the previous across species, but I'm just showing the mean of the small conductance and the mean of that slope. Now, okay, with respect to cavitation risk, there's a couple different strategies that plants tend to take. One is isohydry, and I kind of scoured the literature to see which of these taxa use which strategies. The acers and the platinists are in fact both isohydric, meaning they try to avoid cavitation risk. They try to maintain a modest stomatal conductance rate, and they would be expected to have a negative GS rate. Negative delta GS. Platinus, as we talked about, maybe has reasons for doing things a little bit differently on the delta GS front, but things largely fall in line. With respect to this other strategy called anisohydry, these are species that don't really mind risking cavitation because they have means of recovering from it. But the Quercus, the oaks, are examples of them, as well as Cornus. And so you would expect these to have higher stomatal conductance rates and near zero delta GS, which we're seeing in the case of in some of the cases. The Cornus is an exception on the GS side. I think, though, that's because they were pretty heavily infected by a rust fungus. They still have a pretty moderate delta GS. And the Quercus rover, that may be exceptional on the delta GS front for the same reason the Platinus is, with avoiding really low water potentials and maintaining access to water through deeper roots, and etc. Interestingly, the Malus, the crabapple in this case, was able to. So I found a paper that showed that Malus are isohydric. However, they have a delayed closure. They kind of approach that line of cavitation before shutting down. And that makes them a lot more like an anisohydric species, which may explain why they're falling out that way. So, I guess what I'm trying to say with all of this is that the biology of the plants does seem to have some explanatory power. And bringing it to bear on the design of the trenches really could be a good idea. Not to say that there is no consideration, but the more nuance, the more detail that we can bring in, the better. So I guess I'll turn my attention to the design implications of all this work before moving on to the bioswales. Couple of comments here. Generally speaking, gravel beds can be shallower. Design manuals are changing to the extent that we can not deliberately build in deeper trenches and overdesign. That would be great. No need to make them deeper if it's not called for. It'd be great in as many cases as possible to actually measure the hydraulic conductivity or percolation rate of the underlying soil. I believe that is a provision for sizing, but the more that dynamic sizing can be used, the better. It should also be possible, even in the context of static sizing, to increase water entry into soil pits from above. Permeable pavement, sloping sidewalks towards the tree pits could really help. And using soil with a little bit better water retention ability. I think PWD is starting to do that. I know clay is a little more expensive, but could be worth that investment. And providing some deeper soil. The entire tree pit doesn't necessarily have to be extended, but wouldn't it be great if there was maybe a channel of soil that trees could send roots down through, instead of having to kind of scurry through the gravel beds. And in fact, that would, more generally, thinking about roots as things that will escape the tree pits, probably useful. Getting the distribution pipes out of the way if possible. And selecting species that can tolerate these extended dry periods that inevitably will occur. So we have a couple of papers that get into this in more detail, but at this point, I would like to wrap up the tree trench work and think about the bioswale study. Quick time check, about 15 minutes. All right.
Are you asking a question or?
No, I was talking to myself. I just
Okay.
wanted to check the time. Looks like I can talk for another 15 minutes before I annoy anyone. Thanks, though. So this second project was, again, a collaboration between Villanova University and Temple. It's a multi-year study and it's ongoing. It has to do with the fact that I-95 is being renovated over a very large stretch in northern Philadelphia, and PennDOT is putting in many, many GSIs as part of their agreement with the city to prevent prevent stormwater and CSOs in the Delaware River. And so we came in a few years ago, 2017, I guess it was, to give input at that time, specifically at this set of basins at GR2, they call it, that's shown down here, so that they could improve their design and maintenance activities in future phases. And so the work that I'm going to describe now is a piece of that. I'll be focusing on these basins labeled A, C, D, and G. Just yesterday, we were out there and we had a drone that I would like to show just an image of what these basins can look like when they're relatively new and working as intended. You can see they've got inlets. There's one over here. There's one back here. There's one that's now out of the screen. The water comes in and is captured there. But you can also see that there's a very, aesthetic quality to them. That is definitely a big part of what the designers are intending to provide, because that's what people see. So, returning our attention to the older basins, those basins in GR2, essentially, over the course of the years, what we saw in tracking a couple thousand plants was that the trees and shrubs hung on well, but the perennials and bulbs and even the grasses, graminoids, really went into precipitous declines. And the picture kind of tells the story here. There are many fewer perennials, and they've largely been replaced by weedy species. I guess you could say ecology happened, but what this does tell us is that the species that were put in were not well adapted to the disturbance and resource regimes that they were experiencing, that these GSIs provide. So there's a lot I could talk about. I'm going to focus in on soil salinity because that influences water stress, the topic of our talk here today, and asking how that could play a role in the higher mortality rates and stunted growth that we're seeing among especially some of these functional groups. So both the water quality team at Temple as well as we, the plant team, did do a lot of monitoring of the salinity conditions. The water quality team has measured the highway runoff. This is over a couple of years. They see the conductivity spikes in winter, and that leads to increases in winter in the soil pore water and groundwater. We, the plant team, focused on the soils and basically across these 22 locations, which span areas very near inlets. These blue arrows denote the inlets. Especially after winter storms, there are very big spikes. Salinity levels are very high, and to give you a more kind of direct view of that, these are 100 milliliter samples evaporated off to show just how much salt is in there. So the question really is, does the salt stick around? Right? Plants are not trying to do much of anything in this environment in the winter, but during the summer, they need to be able to transpire, them to be able to grab that water despite any osmotic tension from the soil. Salts will be a problem. And what we saw in these soils is that especially near the inlets and the middle parts of basins, and this is month by month through 2018, there were pretty rapid declines through the spring, but the salt did stick around into the summer. And what these kind of zones are denoting here is absolute soil salinity categories as described by an Australian document. But point being, even low salinity soils can be problematic for plants that are not adapted for salty soils to begin with. What we did the following year was attempted to trace what happened with this salt. Right? Does it migrate vertically or does it migrate horizontally? I have to admit, a grad student did a modeling project that maybe does a better job of encapsulating this, but what I'm going to show you is our attempt to stick a very long probe down into the soil and trace some of that. Again, in winter, the inlets are the areas where salt is building up to a great extent. What we saw, at least this year, was that it actually kind of started declining, but then the deeper depths almost rose higher than expected. What I haven't told you is that at around 55 centimeters depth, there is a change in the soil type. It goes from the amended soil that was put in place to the native soil that's fairly compacted and very different texture. Essentially, we think that a lot of the water is migrating vertically, but it's being trapped in that deeper soil layer and maybe even slightly above it. Again, the modeling work tells a similar story, but maybe does it more convincingly. I'll move on, though, to talk about the plants. What we tried to do here was look at, I think it was 72 plants across the microtopographic gradient, because those at the lower ends of that gradient would experience exposure to stormwater much more frequently. And we looked at a number of plant characteristics, including leaf areas, right? So this is a metric of leaf expansion. It turns out that leaf expansion is one of the first things that plants restrict when encountering more salty soils than they are ready for. It's a way of conserving water. In 7 of the 9 species that we saw, when exposed to greater amounts of stormwater, and this is at the lower parts of the gradient as measured by the mean water content across several visits, most species are in fact generating smaller leaves on average. In these 2 exceptional cases, they are in fact decreasing their canopy sizes. I don't think I have a graph of that, but I do have some pictures that kind of make that pretty clear. Right, so this is dogwood, hemerocallis, daylily. This is bee balm, and this is reed feathergrass. In all cases, plants are much smaller at those lower topographic zones. I guess this is some data from a subset of plants on canopy size. So we think that salt is likely playing a pretty important role here, but I'll come back to that in a second. What I'd like to point out is that when looking at hemerocallis specifically, we saw an interesting phenomenon where there was a decreased gas exchange rates, both photosynthesis and small conductance, in the lower parts of the basins, but also at the higher parts of the basins. And in fact, we saw curves that looked a lot like this, excluding the drop in the lower parts of the basins, meaning that we think many of the species are actually experiencing water stress because of not receiving enough water, rapidly draining soils, only being watered from direct precipitation. I'm going to quickly make the case that we do know that it really is salinity. It really is the salts that are causing that, not just simply exposure to stormwater due to inundation effects. So we did trace the salts into the plant tissues. We did this in July, so the soil levels had dropped by then. I'm showing topographic position as the 3 different colors and the 3 species in separate plots here. But basically, this is just USGS data across the country showing what concentrations tend to be. We're definitely not up in the coastal zone here, but it probably would have been earlier in the season. In any case, in all 3 cases, the plants were bringing sodium into their roots. And in the case of dogwood, into the stems, and in the case of daylily, into the leaves. Iris, questionable, but possibly. Especially in the case of daylily, we really do see that there are enormous effects, both due to osmotic, certainly suggestive of osmotic effects, but also direct toxic effects from sodium. A typical level is 500 milligrams per kilogram in plant tissue, but this is far exceeding that. So I'm trying to make the case that the soil salinity is a major factor, especially in these basins that are directly adjacent to the highways. Even though the rainwater that they're receiving during the season is not laden with salts, there is a residual effect from those winter applications. We have thought about some possible solutions, and we're investigating them. Using salt-tolerant species is a big one. Perhaps flushing basins with fresh water, maybe around late April, could be helpful. And also including biochar in soils could be helpful. So again, these are things that we're trying to learn more about. Let me do a time check again. I will really briefly describe this last piece, which is our effort to quantify evapotranspiration before wrapping up. But basically, in that furthest south basin, Basin A, we've made an effort to try to quantify ET better than it typically has been done. A review paper came out last year showing that ET can be pretty substantial. Direct you to the paper to find out more, but ET is really difficult to measure, and typically engineers just model it. What we're trying to do is find out what rates could be of ET, specifically in PennDOT's basins, how they compare to modeled values, and what kinds of variation the models could be missing. Specifically focusing on microtopography, plant canopy size, and spatial variation in shade. I think it's in our best interest to come back to this later if you're very interested, but I'll just mention that version 1.0 of our effort has suggested that basins release about 1 plus or minus 0.5 liters per meter squared per day. What the plot on the right basically shows is that it occurs mainly a couple days out from storms. If you want the details, I'll give them later, but I just want to tell you that we're working on a version 2.0. We're trying to quantify evapotranspiration more rigorously and in a spatial sense. We're trying to combine our empirical measurements, which are basically done by putting these chambers on sections of the basin and measuring the accumulation of water in those chambers. There's soil moisture sensor networks. We're using this kind of shade analysis to get at spatial variation in light availability. Canopy height by a combination of photogrammetry and LiDAR. And we're also running some ET models based on Villanova's weather data. And so we're hoping to be able to help the modelers determine how well modeling can work and maybe improve the way that they're estimating ET. With that, I will wrap it up and say thank you to all of you for listening, and thank my collaborators and funders. Just in case you were wondering, that allusion to the water, water everywhere comes from the rhyme of the ancient mariner.
Thanks, Josh. Really interesting. We are going to open the floor to questions. I think the easiest way to do this, Jason will be keeping track on the chat. If you put a question into the chat, he will invite you to unmute and ask your question in the order in which we see the questions, and we'll keep going until the end of the time. So take it away, whoever wants to go first. I'm not seeing questions in there yet, but hopefully you can find the chat and put them in.
When I've been on the other side, it always takes me a little while to type the question. So
Right.
There's a delay here.
Not trying to rush people, just letting them know.
Gives me a chance to catch my breath as well.
Bottom right, next to where the participant list is. So.
Hi, Josh. This is Erin Rivers here. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes. Okay,
super. Super interesting talk. I'm really excited to see some of your work. I am a former PSU grad as well.
Okay.
So I did my dissertation in Portland, and it's really common there to see really desiccated bioswales in the summer just because of the climate. And I know that a lot of places are struggling with that. And I'm out in the West now. I'm in Utah, and I know that there's a lot of questions about kind of how to maintain these in the interim when we're not getting a lot of rain. And I'm curious what your opinion on supplemental watering in these facilities are, and kind of the role of maintenance.
So I think we should be talking to the Portland, what is it, the water department, or the people that are really on the ground there. So the challenge in Portland is that the periods when there isn't as much water falling from the sky, it's also not as available for being used as a kind of irrigation supplement. So it certainly seems to me that if we're going to prevent some of the really strong hydrologic effects, these plant physiological effects, we might need to intervene at some cases, at some times. I don't know if there's a way we can have a decision network set up, as a set of procedures. Oh, hey, it's been so many days since it's rained. Based on the types of soil media we're using, it is very likely that many of our plants are experiencing problems now. It seems challenging, but maybe it's something that could be aimed for longer term. Again, when water is so little available, especially in the West, especially as climate change is making it less available, it's hard to be a proponent of using water in this way. But again, I think it comes down to species selection as the main thing. Use the biology to your advantage. I see Matt has a question in there. Do you want to ask it, or should I try to read it?
Sure, I'll ask it. My question is about the soil amendments that folks are considering for the trenches. You mentioned that they were really coarsely grained, and then that folks were considering clay as a possibility. And I guess what I was curious about was whether there was any effort to design fill that would have a sort of a meta structure that would have micropore spaces and macropore spaces, so that there would be water holding capacity in dry periods and then rapid drainage elsewhere.
Well, so I honestly don't have a great deal of insight into what people are doing, other than trying to shift more from a loamy sand to a sandy loam in some cases. There's actually a whole slew of basins in the PennDOT site that we're doing some experimental manipulations of the soil, including changing the texture. So maybe I'll have some data to tell you how that works in a few years. But biochar is one that people have been proponents of, both for water quality, but also it could potentially increase water retention. That also is going to be part of this upcoming study. That said, we did a greenhouse study. It was more aligned with green roofs, and we did not see a major improvement in water retention based on the biochar that we were using. I still like the idea of using a little bit more clay than is typically done. It not only does it provide the direct kind of water absorption sites, but it also can lead to aggregation more rapidly. It'd be great to facilitate aggregation happening. Maybe a little more certain types of organic matter that's not so rapidly decaying might also be a help.
Thanks.
Alan, if you want to take your question next.
Yeah, I have to maybe just ask a question and run, as I've got a meeting in about 3 minutes.
Sure.
Josh, I'm just wondering, since you have such knowledge about roots, all the work you've done, I'm just wondering what can be done to encourage the trees, to encourage the root systems to more quickly access these deeper areas, soil amendments and other things that might be possible. I don't know.
So I guess I mentioned, let me reiterate what I did say before, which just in case anyone didn't catch it, not saying you didn't, Alan, but the engineers don't want the roots to escape the soil pits. And this is a specific issue in tree trenches. But if we provide them a sort of easily penetrable soil, and just in a small channel that allows them to kind of seek a deeper water source in kind of a section of that soil pit, that could be a help. Now, this is something that that's just crossing my mind now, but as CO2 levels go up, that will often encourage plants to increase their root growth. I don't know that would have a big enough effect over a tree's lifetime. But interestingly, that is something that we may see, that there could be greater root growth just because of that. Whether nutrients could be manipulated to encourage or discourage growth at differing heights, that's something that I just crossing my mind now, right? So in other words, if we sort of manipulate the availability of nutrients through the depth, the problem with a lot of these more complicated solutions is that they're more expensive. The most basic and simple solutions are often the ones that will actually get adopted, as I'm sure you know. So, you know, I do typically like to think of, you know, simple solutions like, can we do a better job of just choosing the species to begin with?
So you're saying it's biologists versus engineers.
Maybe I'm biased, but
I mean, I would agree, but you know,
it could go a long way. We could do a better job of incorporating biology into the planning of these systems.
Thanks a lot, Josh.
Good to see you, Alan. Take care.
I had a quick question.
Please go ahead.
So on the salinity study, since I'm not too familiar with road salts, was that mostly just sodium chloride you were seeing for the road salts, or were there other types being used?
So we've asked PennDOT what they tend to apply, and yeah, they basically there are salt mines distributed across the Northeast, where lots of salt is basically dug out of the ground, and so most of the salts that are applied in Philadelphia, I assume in Baltimore as well, is just sodium chloride. I think calcium chloride is used. You know, like if you go to Home Depot or something, buy a bag of de-icing salt, I think that's where you'll encounter the calcium chloride more often. I don't know that big agencies are using it as much. This is not my area of expertise, but that's my understanding.
Makes sense.
We definitely saw a lot of sodium, as I mentioned before.
There is a brine mixture being added to roadways around here these days, and I don't know, I mean, as a way of, I guess, reducing the total amount of salt they put down, but I don't know whether that's any different in composition. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, right. So, yeah, I think that often is made from sodium chloride predominantly, but the advantage of kind of dissolving it into a solution is that, you know, then the salt crystals don't just get washed off the roadway. And in fact, I didn't show suspended solids, but the water quality team in the PennDOT project has found lots of kind of undissolved road salts making their way down into the basins as well.
Yeah, I mean, that brine is a lot of, I think they use probably less, and it's a pre-treatment, so.
Mm-hmm. And I do see them using that on the roadways around here as well.
Yeah. There's a question here from Sarah Ponte. So Sarah, you want to unmute and ask the question?
Oh, hi, hi Josh. So I was interested because I work with, I'm a PhD student working with Mitch Pavan-Zuckerman, working also with Nancy, she's on the call. And I was wondering, because you showed that red maple had a decrease in stomatoconductance with an increase in VPG. But we saw that for subflux, there was a higher subflux with increase in VPG. Do you know what is causing this difference?
So my memory was that we actually did see an increase, but I'm going to want to look at my slide to make sure. What did we see for the red maple?
Maybe I saw it different.
Yeah, it would be great if our data sets agreed, wouldn't it? Quercus robur. Yeah, no, I can share my screen again if you want to see it, but we actually did see an increase as well with
with maple, because I noticed the same thing that Sarah did.
Oh, sorry. Maybe this is me getting my names mixed up. Oh, sorry. I was looking at Quercus robur, getting my oaks and maples mixed up. That's an even bigger problem. Okay, now I see what you're talking about. Absolutely. Can I explain that difference? I'm going to have to say no. I don't know why we would be seeing such differences there. Now, I will point out that I don't think you're saying that you're working with tree trenches. Perhaps that is some of the difference right there.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're working with trees over turf grass.
Okay. It may be the case that simply without a supplemental water supply, these trees just weren't able to have enough water input to be able to maintain what they would have done otherwise and kind of raise their stomatal conductance and transpiration rates.
I wonder too if the soils are different because we're working with kind of remnant forest patches in some cases, not engineered soil, so the water holding capacities would probably be different. Those dynamics also. That's really cool.
Yeah, we should come back to that at a later time, perhaps.
Okay, thank you.
So we are at a couple of minutes past 1. So I'm going to stop the recording in just a moment. I want to thank Josh for a really, really interesting seminar. Also, a number of folks have said they're interested in hanging around for a bit for what we're calling a virtual lunch. Anyone who's here who's interested in sticking around and chatting for a bit, I think we'll just go grab something and bring it back so people can sit and chat for a bit. So I'm going to turn off the recording, but I'm going to leave the session open. I actually created a separate WebEx, but I think as long as this one doesn't shut down on us, we can just stay in here. So anybody who's said they're interested, or anybody who is just interested in sticking around, we will resume in a few minutes. I'm going to turn the recording off now, and we'll leave the session open. So give people a chance to go grab a sandwich or whatever it is, and then come back just in a few minutes. Thanks.
I'll be right back.
And in case it does shut down, we have the link that we can send to anyone wanting to stick around. So.
Okay.